Finance and Food in Crisis. Next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. The current economic meltdown has shaken the sense of security enjoyed by citizens of the world's wealthiest nations. But for the Earth's nearly 1 billion people who face hunger every day, insecurity has long been a way of life. In our interconnected economy, when the rich nations of the global north catch cold, poor countries often get pneumonia. To help us explore the impact the global financial downturn is having on the world's most vulnerable citizens, we're joined by a practitioner who confronts the crisis every day. Christopher Delgado is a strategy and policy advisor at the World Bank, where he manages the coordinating secretariat for the bank's Global Food Crisis Response Program. He previously worked at the International Food Policy Research Institute and served as a part-time member of the faculty at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Delgado, welcome to International Focus.
Well, thanks a lot, Doug. It's great to be here.
Well, I wonder if you could help us understand the term food crisis. The saying goes, the poor have been with us always. Now, what's different now? What makes this a crisis?
Well, right now, everyone feels vulnerable. I mean, I challenge you to find anybody who doesn't feel vulnerable anywhere in the world right now. But there is no vulnerability that's worse than having no money and no food and watching your children go hungry. And in 2008, actually starting around October 2007, you had practically a doubling of food prices within a few months around the world. I mean, it started in global markets, but it certainly showed up in domestic markets. And for people who have to rely on the market for their food, and who spend, as many poor people do in the world, more than half their income on food, and it doubles, and it was unforeseen, unpredictable, this is a major problem. And it's made harder by, at the same time, fuel prices were high, governments didn't have much money that they could use to help. The real problem, the worst thing about being poor is you have no flexibility. I mean, if you have any reserves at all, if you have any discretionary income, it may hurt, but you can roll with the punches. But you're truly vulnerable when you don't have anything, and then you're confronted by something like that.
So what was there about that period that made it sort of a perfect storm for food security?
Well, nothing happens just out of the blue. But the last time we saw something like this was in 1974. And I don't know, you're almost young enough not to remember, but I remember lining up in 1974 to fuel my car, and when gas prices went through the roof. At that time, also grain prices, which is really the basic food staple we're talking about, rice, wheat, corn, things like that, they were also very volatile. I mean, they went like that. And they were relatively high. And then, starting sometime in the late 70s, and really for the next 25 years, you had a steady decrease in the real cost, the inflation-adjusted cost of grain. And you also it became a much more stable thing over time. It was reliable. And in fact, the penalty for neglecting your agricultural policy in developing countries became much less. So both governments and donors put less money into agriculture. But sometime things began to change sort of insidiously, as they do around 2000. And as we came into the new millennium, volatility of prices, particularly for wheat, not for rice, but for wheat and corn, started going up. And it happened slowly, but when oil prices took off in 2007, then grain prices followed. And in fact, we saw the changes that happened. Corn prices, which were never, and corn has always been quite correlated with wheat, but corn prices, which had never been particularly well correlated with oil prices, even though oil prices are very closely correlated with costs like fertilizer and with transport and so forth. As oil became expensive, more than $50 a barrel, we saw that the correlation of the monthly price movements of corn were much more correlated to oil prices than they had been before. In fact, if you like this kind of thing, it was 75% correlated as opposed to 5% correlated. And we also, this was a time when there was a lot of money sloshing around, a lot of petrodollars, other kinds of dollars sloshing around because of trade surpluses and so forth, run by major players elsewhere in the world. And that money is looking for a home, and it's invested in assets, and most of it went into things like treasury bills in the United States. But some of it, including some dollars here from investors here, started flowing into commodity index funds. And in fact, between 2003 and 2007, $250 billion went into commodity index future funds in the U.S. alone, and that started by the end of 2007. That was more than a quarter of all U.S. agricultural futures, and that means that futures, which used to be bought by, if people who made cornflakes wanted to know what they were going to have to pay for corn 6 months from now, they'd buy a corn future. That's a commercial transaction, but you saw this steady rise in non-commercial transactions in future markets.
So speculation, basically.
Well, speculation's an emotive term, but basically anybody who buys something in the hope that the price will go up is a speculator, if you like, and if in that sense you could say it's speculation. But basically you saw that commodities became an investment. And as that happened, the problem is that other commodities that were linked, such as oil principally, but also metals, are historically much more volatile than food. Food was not historically a particularly price volatile kind of commodity compared to other commodities. But food has started to take on some of this volatility. And you asked why it's a crisis. It's a crisis because it happened in a few months and it was unforeseen. 3/4 of the world's poor, the really abject poor, the one the official benchmark now is in 2005 dollars that make more than, less than $1.25 a day. Of those people, 3/4 of them are rural, and almost all of them get some or all of their livelihood from farming. So if you said, let's have a doubling of agricultural prices, and it was perfectly predictable over a 10-year period, which would give time for people to adjust, to get money, to invest in their enterprise, to learn new skills, and to really get serious about this, then that would be great. It would be wonderful. But to have it happen when people aren't prepared, when people have actually trusted markets, they've gone out and done other things and then want to go back to the market to buy some of their food, this made them extremely vulnerable. And it was a crisis. And you had large numbers in capital cities, particularly urban people who were not involved in agriculture at all, that were going out on the street and rioting. Because in poor countries, the price of food is the basic social compact between a government and its people. We're talking in the very poor countries. People care about all sorts of things, but the thing that they will not put up with is not being able to feed their children. That's the end of the road. And that's what was reached in 2008, and particularly in the first half of 2008.
Well, could you talk a little bit more about how volatility affects just a small-scale producer? If I'm a rice producer in, name your country, Thailand.
Well, in any country. You can be a rice producer in Arkansas, too, and have several thousand acres. If you don't know what your price is going to be next year, it's hard for you to get a loan, and you're probably even reluctant to put your own resources, whatever they are, into it. And if you're a small producer in a poor country, let's say Laos, for example, the stakes are a little bit higher simply because if you guess wrong, your family is going to starve. So So you tend to err on the side of prudence, and particularly the higher the uncertainty is, the more likely you're going to go for self-sufficiency, even if that's not the best use of your resources. So even if you were terribly poor before, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Chad, and I later lived in a village in a place called Burkina Faso, and right in the dry part of the middle of West Africa. And at the time I lived there, people would put almost all their resources into growing a little bit of millet or sorghum, which they'd use to feed their families. And if they had a little bit of land or time was the big constraint, or a little capital to invest, they might do a little something else to improve their standard of living. Well, over time, people began to count on markets for providing the food, and they'd go into these higher return type activities like fruits and vegetables, livestock, maybe a little non-farm work somewhere else, maybe a little commerce and so forth. They'd get into these activities, but that was all predicated on the fact that you had a predictable and stable food market, and suddenly, bang, it wasn't there. And so people are becoming risk-averse again, and their standard of living is suffering as a result. And countries are becoming risk-averse. I mean, sometime around last February 2008, virtually every government in the world began rethinking its food security strategy, and that's a vocabulary we hadn't really heard since the 1970s. And governments were doing what they had to do. They had to deliver. Basically, they could not stay in power if they did not deliver, and a few of them fell. But they started building up grain buffer stocks at great cost. They started regulating the price of food. They started doing a whole host of things that provided some short-term relief, particularly for urban people, but eventually prevented even any good coming out of this, because then people were reluctant to really get into farming to help feed their own country, because they couldn't be sure at the end of the day if there'd be any return from doing it. So
is the net effect of all of these factors more on the price side? People can't afford food, or is it actually a question of supply? There just simply isn't enough food to go around.
Well, it is true that you have droughts now, and that's one reason that I think I personally believe that food prices are going to go back up again in a while. I mean, you have a major drought in China, you have a drought in Argentina, you have a residual drought in Australia. These are all big grain producers. And in fact, after falling somewhat, prices have come back up about 10% since December for the major grains. And that's also a reflection of the volatility. You don't have much in the way of stocks now like you used to. And that means that people don't have a lot of confidence that the system will sort of work itself out, and they start behaving defensively again. And it's that defensive behavior that adds to the volatility.
Well, I want to get into how the economic downturn plays into this, but first we're going to take a short break. So our viewers will be right back on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about the global food crisis with Christopher Delgado from the World Bank. Well, before our break, we were talking a little bit about the food crisis we were hearing about perhaps 6 months ago, and now, of course, the headlines are dominated by the financial crisis. And how have the two really intersected? And how has the financial crisis impacted some of the issues we were talking about earlier?
Well, the financial crisis impacts everyone. They impact us in the wealthy parts of the world. They also impact the other 4/5 of the world's population in the less wealthy parts. And so no one is untouched. But at least the World Bank estimated that at the height of the food crisis, The food price rise alone had pushed more than 100 million people back below that $1.25 absolute poverty line. The current estimate is that the financial crisis has pushed about 44 million back. And what that illustrates is that, again, for the poorest of the poor, the real thing that really affects their income and their quality of life is the food price. Now, when you have a little more income, you start spending things that require fuel. When you have a little more income, you start having electricity, which the poor usually don't. And you start having other things. So what the financial crisis, for one thing, it's brought it home to income groups besides the poor. And it's also, I think, and more tellingly for the poor, if poor governments had any ability, any money, what we call fiscal space, if you like, to deal with safety nets or to help people out, that's gone, because it started going with the high fuel price, because most poor countries tend to import fuel. But it's also gone now with all the other things that governments have to worry about paying for. And for the very poor and the vulnerable countries of the world, they really are strapped. They are really strapped.
So you mentioned the rise in commodity prices, and on its face, it would seem like if you're a producer, even a small-scale producer, that would be a good thing. Is that not the case in this situation?
Well, it's a good thing if you can respond. Almost all the response to the food price rise, the supply response that's happened since the prices started going up in fall of 2007 has been in the wealthy countries, because they can get access to the inputs, they can get loans. Certainly they could until fairly recently anyway. And that's where the supply responses happened. Almost none of the supply responses happened in the poor countries. And that's not because people aren't rational or don't want to produce more, but because if you're at the end of a long supply chain, and fertilizer, for example, is only made in a few places, it's very capital intensive and in production. And if you're at the end of a long supply chain where you're importing fertilizer and you're exporting grain maybe, or self-sufficient in grain, your grain prices, take Zambia for example, which is a landlocked country in southern Africa, where at the height of the crisis in May 2008, grain prices, your basic food price, which accounted for 80% of food expenditures by households, that went up by 30%. But fertilizer went up by 400%. So your costs of growing, and certainly of expanding production, went up to the point where it really was difficult to do. And that's why one of the things that we need to do in sort of transiting from the short term to the long term is to keep smallholder farmers in business, to help them stay in business, which they very much want to do, and they don't have other options, basically. And then to help transit to where they sort of do very well on their own in the farming business and being more productive.
Well, there certainly were some sort of big picture plans. I'm thinking of like the Millennium Development Goals set and seem to perhaps be making some headway before this current financial downturn. How, on sort of the largest level, how has the downturn really affected where we are in meeting things like those development goals?
Well, organizations like the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, keep track of the world's chronically malnourished, and the estimate before the onset of the big price events of 2008 was that you had about 870 million people that went to bed hungry all the time. I mean, they were chronically malnourished. And the estimates vary, but generally up to between 40 and 70 million were added to that number during the food crisis. And the consensus is the most recent estimate is still 923 million. So that in terms of Millennium Development Goal 1, we've stepped backwards. In terms of poverty alleviation, the broader question, during the height of the food crisis and immediately thereafter, we really, at least at the bank, some of our colleagues estimated that 7 years of poverty alleviation were lost. 7 years.
And
so it's quite a setback.
What about the response on the part of the wealthier nations since the financial meltdown? I mean, have you seen sort of a retrenching in the rich countries?
Well, I think the response has been mixed at this point. And why might that be? I mean, one, we presently have a major financial crisis that everyone's worried about. The second reason for mixed responses generally, I mean, in the general theory of mixed responses, is if people don't know or don't believe. Now, one of the things that the food crisis did, I mean, the silver lining, is that even before the crisis, you had 870 million malnourished people, and there was no attention to that, very little attention. I mean, organizations like mine would publish reports on it, but, you know, who cared? The poor will always be with you. Now, at least, the human face of that sort of came home, and the important thing is that it's really time to do something about this, and we can do it. The world has the ability to do something about this. And we had, not to be parochial, but at the bank we had something called the World Development Report 2008, which can be downloaded from the World Bank website easily. That was the first time in 25 years that the major flagship publication, annual publication of the World Bank, dealt with agriculture. It was called Agriculture and Development. That developed a broad international consensus with inputs from around the world on what needed to be done to really get the poor who are involved in agriculture to be productive members, not to be living on handouts, but to be productive members of society in a way that they weren't being at the time it was written. So we have a blueprint. We now have the public interest, because people can understand more. The tragedy is that we have the financial crisis in the donor countries that very understandably make people look inwards. But we live in an increasingly linked world, and when people have gotten to the point that they got to in 2008, they're just sort of opting out of that world, and unfortunately it's not an option for the wealthy 1/5 of the world's population just to opt out and build a big wall, because that doesn't work anymore, and we've seen too much of the consequences of states that fall apart because people just think that there's nothing left in it for them.
Well, could you tell us a little bit about what your office is doing in the food crisis response program of the bank?
Well, a program that I work with, which of course involves a lot of people, is just a drop in the bucket. But what it is that when the consciousness began dawning broadly, let's say in the early spring of 2008, that something needed to be done, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, convened a meeting of all the heads of UN agencies and also the World Bank head and the IMF head. And they met in Switzerland and they said, we have to work together on this. And so that we agreed to work with our partners in the UN and to work with anyone who wanted to work on this topic. And then we followed a two-prong approach. One, we worked within that framework, and we got something going on our own. And what we got going on our own, we started at the middle of April, and by the end of May, we had produced a document which anyone can download from the World Bank website called the Global Food Crisis Response Program Framework Document. That was sort of a covenant with our board, and we shared this with the UN too, and the UN later used large sections of this for the overall document, which they call a comprehensive framework for action for the UN system. But we sat 20 people down who worked in different parts of the world on different kinds of things that were pertinent to the food crisis. And we said, governments will choose, this is a political crisis, so governments will choose what they want to do. We're not going to tell them what to. But here are a menu of things that we think will be very helpful and how they can be done. And we laid this out in 100 pages and how it could be done. And the bank's board agreed to this, and they agreed to two other things. They put up $200 million out of the bank's reserves for grant money to the most vulnerable countries. And they agreed to waive their normal, extremely long and careful procedures or to allow us to get started using the bank's regular lending funds, their concessional money under the International Development Association, or the commercial money under the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the two main parts of the World Bank.
Well, on some of the specific projects, I guess we'll direct people to the website. We have less than a minute left. Wonder if you could just tell our viewers what they could do if they're interested in weighing in on this.
This is one of the big issues of our age, and if there's anyone out there who's listening who is thinking, who's maybe a student who's thinking what's important to do in this world, I would hope they'll go out and look, and there's lots of things to do, but this is one where it's going to require major effort over a major time period to make progress, but there's really no alternative not to dig in and get started.
Well, I guess we'll leave it at that. Christopher Delgado, thank you for being with us. To our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus.
Programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,